Thanks very much for coming, especially in the freezing cold. I'd say the journey from Galway out to here was probably interesting for a lot of people. So tonight is the first night, or the first part of Congregation, and it's loosely themed, the past meets the future. Tomorrow being about the future, and then we have the past kind of covered on Sunday. And we've 4 really interesting speakers. I've got previews of their slides, so I can say this with good authority. So first up we have Mike Mulligan from Ancestry.com. Mike is the principal product manager with Ancestry and launched Ancestry in Mexico, and also led the launch of DNA product in Ireland and the UK. And Mike is going to talk us through how DNA can be used to unlock who you really are, who your ancestors are. Unfortunately, John Tierney, who is with Historic Graves, can't be with us tonight, but this sounds like Eurovision now. But he sent he sent through a video of his presentation a little bit earlier today. So we'll follow Mike up with John, and John is going to give us a good snapshot of storytelling through archaeology and the use of geolocation data sets. Then we have Stephen Howell. Stephen is here from Smart Labs, amongst many other titles. And Stephen's presentation is going to be a really interactive one. We'll take a break from the PowerPoint version and go into it, but you'll understand when you see it. It's about digital puppetry, and it's ways for students that they can connect with their interest in art, history, computational thinking, and English narrative, and how do you combine all of those together. And you'll see elements of some of the programming background that Stephen has kind of come through, and he shows how simple it actually is. Anyone here played Scratch? How many people have played Scratch? Okay, so you recognise kind of a lot of it in this later on. And then Gar, who's still on his way and will be here in time, I was talking to him a few minutes ago. Gar is co-founder of Mind Rising, and he's going to talk about some student projects that they have done where students have retold history using Minecraft. And it's fascinating to kind of watch that kind of creativity where kids have created historical backgrounds or historical scenes. And he's also going to talk about some tools that he has brought, that he's developing at the moment, to help people envisage what the future could look like. So he's going to unveil both of those when he kind of comes. So Mike, if you're ready, we'll kick off with Mike. This is going to really sound like Late Late Show because Mike has to point at me and I have to press the buttons on the computer to change it. So okay, roll it there to that.
Okay, good evening everyone.
Evening.
Good evening. So my name's Mike Mulligan, and I'm going to be talking tonight about DNA. And in case you don't know, I'm sure most of you have some idea what DNA is. It's the little molecules inside all the cells of our body that tell us how to build ourselves, amongst other things. And I want to start off by just talking a little bit about where I came to this, because I've been a genealogist since I was this high. My grandmother used to tell me lots of stories about relatives. I grew up in Donegal, so in Donegal we're all related to each other. We tend to be proud of that fact sometimes. But I got to know, when I bring my wife on, my wife's from the Ukraine, and I say, that's my second cousin, that's my third cousin. She says, just stop pointing, they're all your cousins. So you kind of know growing up in Donegal where you're from to a certain point. But when I started doing it more rigorously and finding out, where's that person from, where's that from, I hit the same brick wall that most genealogists in Ireland hit. And that's somewhere around the famine time where just the records dry up and we can go no further. But I always wanted to know what was further back than that. And then I got lucky enough to actually get a job with Ancestry in later life and actually do for a living what I was spending all my hours at night on. And what I have to say is in the last 10, 15 years, we really are in a genealogy revolution. And that's no understatement. When I first looked up the 1911 census for my family, I was 15 years old. I went down to the Four Courts in Dublin, and I went in and I said, I want to see the 1911 census for Cullenboy and Donegal. Porter went out and handed me a box of the originals to a 15-year-old, and he said, just don't drive on them. There was no idea of document conservation. There was no idea that this is actually a precious document. You shouldn't let a 15-year-old near it. Now when I want to look up the 1911 census, I go online to the National Archive. If I want to look up a GRO birth cert, civil birth cert, I go online to Irish genealogy. If I want to look up a parish record, I go online. So all the records now are online, and what used to take years is now taking minutes. But we're still hitting a lot of the same brick walls. And those brick walls are, again, around about 1800s when the paper record dries up. So DNA has come along, and DNA is the story of us in a very, very fundamental way. About 2001, 2003 with the final draft, but in 2001, the very first human genome was sequenced and published. It cost $3 billion to do that project. It was a human genome project that started in the 90s and finished up in 2001. It works out as $1 per letter of our DNA. Our DNA is composed of about 3 billion letters. Now, today, fast forward 15 years or so, and anyone can get their DNA done for next to nothing. In fact, because it's Black Friday, I know on our website at the moment it's €60 to get your own DNA test done on Ancestry. So we've gone from 1 billion down to €60. So a lot more people are testing, a lot more people are finding out about DNA, and that numbers is also allowing us to unlock new things about DNA. So at the moment, on the Ancestry database, we've tested about 2.5 million people. Globally, it's somewhere around 5 million people who've taken the DNA test. And just to show you how hands-on this has become, this is my actual DNA here. This is from chromosome 16. We each have 23 chromosomes, 22 autosomes, and one pair of sex chromosomes. So we have 23 pairs. This is somewhere in the middle of chromosome 16. And these are the letters of my DNA, A, T, G, A, T, G. And this is the alphabet of DNA. This is the code that builds us. It's also the code that over the last 15 years, scientists around the world and citizen scientists, because a lot of it's been driven by interested amateurs, have been decoding this and figuring out what it means to us. So when we're looking over this weekend about how the future informs the past, what I'm going to be telling you tonight is excerpts probably from the greatest story ever written. It's the story in our DNA. It's pretty epic in scope. It goes right through the history of mankind and hopefully brings us right up to the present. So if we roll it there, Colette. Seeing as this is an epic story, biblical in nature, it seems only right that we start with Adam. The game I used to play with my grandparents when they'd be telling me stories like, who's their parents, who's their parents, who's their parents? And my grandfather had no real interest in genealogy at all, and he used to say we all come from Adam, him meaning the biblical stuff. But in DNA terms, we actually can think about that in a little bit of a different way, because if you think about it, we all have two parents, we all have a father, we all have a mother, and as children often say, they have parents, they have parents. Somebody comes from somewhere. There must have been a first man, there must have been a first woman. And as men, we have a unique disadvantage over women, in that this is the sex chromosome pair. This is an X and this is a Y. Women have two fully formed X chromosomes in their pair. Men have the shrivelly bit on the end here, which we call the Y chromosome. So being a man is actually defined by what you haven't as opposed to what you have. But this Y chromosome is very unique. Now if we go on, we'll see why. The Y chromosome is only in men. So it comes to you from your father. It can't come from your mother. So it comes from father to son, unchanged, virtually unchanged, from father to son all the way through history. So if you think about it, it became totally unchanged. The very, very first man at the dawn of time would have the same Y chromosome. Except something happens just in nature. Every few generations or so, about 7 generations, an error occurs, a mutation. Now, usually when we think of mutation, we think of something harmful. But a mutation can either be harmful or beneficial, or in the vast majority of cases, have no effect, such as the redundancy of DNA. So if we think this was a man somewhere in the past, and this was part of his Y chromosome, he had this string of letters, it was probably a gene that did something useless. But over time, maybe 6 or 7 generations later, another man, a son of his, has the same thing, but a mutation occurs in his Y chromosome. He now is ever so slightly different from his father, just a tiny bit. But his sons will all get this version of the Y chromosome, whereas his brother's sons, which didn't have the mutation, will get a slightly different bit. So straight away we've got 2 slightly different branches of a tree. And as a genealogist, when I look at this, I see trees everywhere. And these mutations, we call them SNPs, SNPs for short. These SNPs accumulate over time. And they do so at a regular rate, which means we can actually analyze when they happened. And when we look at the frequency of men around the world who had them, we can actually see and make a guess where they happened. Now this wonderful spaghetti code of letters at the bottom is my own Y DNA signature. It's a set of mutations I have in my Y DNA. They're not defects, they just are differences from other people. And the earliest mutation that I have here has the wonderful name M42, and that flows through different mutations all the way down to what's called my terminal SNP, which is DF05. And that characterized me, as we'll see, as a certain class of male in Ireland. And I have to illustrate some of these mutations. So for example, L21 here, somewhere in my chromosome, a C is actually a G. So most of the population of the world has a C at L21, I have a G. If we take M343, which is very important for Europe, most of the world has a C, I have an A. So this genetic sequence defines my Y chromosome, and I can use this almost like a genetic signature that would identify me within a population of men. Now if we go to the next slide, I want to talk about some of those SNPs, as we call them. Like I said, the mutation rate is fairly predictable. So that means we can tell when they happen, and if we look at the distribution, we can see where they happen. Now scientists all over the world have been studying these, and here's some of the important ones that I picked out. Like I said, we start with Adam. When we add up all the mutations, we find out that genetic Adam lived approximately 200,000 years ago. So genetic Adam had a few differences from his biblical counterpart. First, very important, he wasn't the only man around at the time. He just won the genetic lottery that means he's the father of all men living. So what I can say is, every man alive who's ever lived traces to him. The next important mutation is M168. And that happens about 100,000 years later. So for 100,000 years, men, and presumably women, because otherwise you wouldn't have more men, have been wandering around Africa. And at 100,000 years, another mutation comes, M168. Every man outside Africa has the M168 mutation. So looking around, I'm fairly certain every man in this room has that M168 mutation. It's the mutation that defines our step out of Africa and into the vastness of Asia. Usually, as far as we can tell, following the coastlines, foraging for food. So go on another 80,000 years, wandering around Asia. The men and the women come to here. And we have another important mutation. This is M343. It's about 20,000 years old. So to just make this real, somewhere about 20,000 years ago, a man had a small little change in his DNA from his father, and that established this line of DNA. M343 is also known as R1b. It's another name for this mutation. And about 40% of all the men in Western Europe come from this branch of the Y tree. So it's quite an important branch for Europe. So we're just walking along my Y at the moment, but as you'll see, it covers a lot of the people in this room. The next one I want to talk about is L21. The reason I've highlighted L21 is its highest frequency. Most men around the world who have it are in this area of the world. This SNP, this mutation, is sometimes called the Northwest Atlantic mutation or the Celtic mutation. And that Celtic mutation probably gives you an idea of what kind of group of men it covers. So all men who have, for want of a better term, a Celtic heritage have L21. And that happened about 6,000 years ago. And where we're getting to at this point in time, we're actually starting to get into prehistory turning to history, and we can tie that up with other archaeological evidence we have, like the Hallstatt culture, the Yamnaya culture, all of those cultures. We're starting to get to fairly modern times. And then the final one is M222. Now I'm just below M222 at another mutation called DF105. M222 is, if such a thing can be said, it's a famous mutation. It happened about 2,000 years ago, so around 080. And M222, if we go on, we'll talk a little more about M222. M222 was the first mutation to appear in the newspaper. There was a landmark study done by Dan Bradley and his team in Trinity, which looked at the M22 mutation. And what they found was the frequency of M222 in the Irish population was very high compared to the rest of the world, reaching a maximum in Northwest Ireland of about 20% of all men. So 1 in 5 men up in Donegal have the M222 mutation. They also noticed when they did this study that the men who had this mutation had surnames like O'Neill and other surnames that are associated with the O'Neill clan. So their hypothesis, which they had a lot of evidence behind, was the reason so many men have this mutation is because it was given to them by a person of high status. And that, in kind of layman's terms, means when you're a king, you get your choice of women. And because Niall was a chieftain and his sons were princes, if you like, they got to spread their seed far and wide. We see this in other cultures. There's a famous tale in Asia that Genghis Khan is the father of about 10% of all Asians. It's not quite true, but it has the same idea. In Egypt, we see that the pharaoh would have many wives and he would have many sons. So this idea of the chief or the king having his way with lots of women is not unusual. So putting two and two together, the newspapers ran with this and it became a bigger thing than the lab ever said. All the lab ever said was there is a strong connection between M222 and Northwest Ireland and the O'Neill clan. And suddenly it was found that the genetic imprint of Niall of the Nine Hostages is found. And forevermore, this is often referred to as the Niall of the Nine Hostages mutation. People tend to think it came from Niall, but Niall, he is somewhere between legend and fact. We're not 100% sure. We think there was a Niall. He certainly didn't do all the things he was claimed to do. And one thing we can definitely say, as he was supposed to live around 500 AD and this mutation happened by 2000, he certainly didn't live 500 years. So if the mutation occurred, it was before Niall, but there's every good possibility that Niall had this. And as I've said, this is my Y-DNA line we've been following. So if any of you want to swear fealty to me as a descendant of the High Kings, I'm more than happy to, but as you see, I have competition. So M222 was the first famous, for want of a better word, mutation that we found in Ireland. And it also brings us just into that border of history from prehistory, where we're talking about people who we believe were real, even if we don't know much about them. If we move on, we will see that since 2006, when M22 was found, we found more genetic signatures that correspond to either Irish men or men of Irish descent around the world. People who can trace, in the diaspora, who can trace their family history into Ireland with certainty. And with very imaginative names, M22 was the first we found. It was known as Irish type 1. And the second one we call Irish type 2, type 3, type 4. For some reason we stopped with numbers and we call this one Irish C. We call this one Clan Cullen and this one Umine, which I'll kind of illuminate further. Now, if you look at the genetic signatures of these groups of men, because that's what this essentially defines, is a group of men numbering in the hundreds or thousands, we notice that their genetic signatures are common in many respects. Firstly, they're all L21. And if you remember, I mentioned L21 is often known as the Celtic mutation. In fact, they're all DF13, which is another mutation further down. And then they start to vary a bit. Now, the genealogist in me sort of wants to push this in the tree, so if we move that on, and we can see this in tree form, this is what happens if you do it in a tree form. This is the Y tree, as best we can put it together right now, of pretty much most Irish men. There's a very specific group not included on this, and that's the Vikings and the Normans. So if you're descended from Vikings and Normans, you actually have a whole different Y tree, but we're focusing essentially on the Celtic Irish, as it were. So if we look at this tree now, one association we managed to clarify, and that's M222 goes to O'Neill. But over the last decade, hundreds, in fact thousands of men have been giving in their Y-DNA, getting it tested, finding out what their genetic signature is and comparing it with other Irish men. And then they've been looking at the surnames and what we know in the annals, things like the Four Masters, the great book of Irish genealogy, which was written around the 1600s. They contain genealogies that, to a modern day genealogist, are a combination of fact and fiction, because they talk about the Firbolg and all sorts of other Malaysians, but they also contain a grain of truth. And we also know that certain surnames are associated with certain clans. I mean, if I said the surname Riley to you, many people in the room say, well, that's a Cavan surname. If I say O'Donnell, that's Donegal. We know where certain surnames occur. So we can start doing the same process as the lab in Trinity did for 222, and we can look at the map of Ireland. And if we go on, this is a partial map of the kingdoms and divisions and tribes and clans of Ireland. The kingdoms of Ireland are a slippery beast. They rise and fall, alliances fade, come, go, friends are on each other's backs next day. So keeping track of it all at any given time is impossible. But I've picked a few here that we know about. So here's O'Neill, here's Connaughton, which seems about right here, and here's Umine, which is quite close to here as well. They had their headquarters around here. Breffni, Oganton, Dalcash, which gave us Brian Baru, Ella, which gave us Eli Carroll, and a few others. So there's been men looking at this and looking at this and seeing can we find a match. And if we look through, we actually have in many cases. So what we have now is the DNA finally putting some fairly scientific evidence on what were the animals, which were creative at best forms of genealogy. And so what we can see is the M222 actually does show up in the Connaughton. It shows up in people who are associated with Doolittle, and in fact all the way out to Scotland and the Dalriad to show up M222. And Breffni is another minor kingdom that shows up 222. So it's not just that it's an O'Neill surname. The best interpretation now is that 222 is actually a Connaughton surname. So not Niall of the 9 hostages, but actually Con of the 100 battles. So we still are descended from High Kings, but it's a guy further back. Really. But we do have others we found, and some of these are found with very definite precision. My favourite one here is the Dalcash, L226. The Dalcash is interesting because it's the tribe that gave us Brian Baru. And out of Brian Baru came the O'Brien family. So every O'Brien that actually is an O'Brien is L226. And the reason Dalcash sticks out of my mind is because Dalcash is one that we've actually managed to prove with full paper trail, full genealogy. And the reason we do that, the Earl of Inchiquin, the Baron, the Prince of Thomond, Sir Conor O'Brien, who is and has a paper trail directly, he is the O'Brien, the head of the clan, has taken the DNA test. And he's L226. So we actually have a royal line proved that matches with the genetics. And so if you're an O'Brien, you're pretty much in luck. You have your mutations verified and you have your paper trail verified. Now, we've had a few O'Briens who found out they're not O'Briens, but that's a whole other story. Some other stories that this is a case where very definitely the DNA backs up the annals and the genealogies. We've had a few cases where the DNA challenges the annals, and one of those is the story of the Umine. In the annals, the story of the Umine is that they are descended from Clan Colla, and Clan Colla are in turn descended from O'Neill. Now, Clan Colla is part of, I told you these tribes get confusing. Clan Colla is part of Argala, or Giala, depending on how you pronounce it. So, the annals state that at some point Argala came from O'Neill, and at some point later the Umine had a row and they went south looking for new land. But the DNA tells us that Clan Colla is over here at Z3000, and in fact, Umine, Connaughton and O'Neill are actually a lot closer, but the Argala are actually on a totally different branch of the tree. Now, our best guess for DF13 is that mutation happened a good, 2,200 years ago. So the annals, as they're described, cannot be accounted for with the DNA evidence. So we have one case where the DNA definitely shows it to be true, another case where the DNA is challenging what the annals say. So the DNA is allowing us to look at paper genealogies which we would have discounted as fiction and actually analyze, well, what is fiction and what is not fiction. It also allows us for the first time to have a sense of where you came from before that 1800 black hole that we have in Irishness. So for example, if we take my terminal SNP DF105, it's actually down here somewhere way below 222. So what I can say is, which seems like a curious thing, just personal background, my mother's Donegal, my dad is Dublin, and he was most amused to find out that my DNA actually puts him as a Donegal person as well. So my DNA tends to put me somewhere here. And in fact, if I look through the annals for the Mulligans were such a minor clan that didn't really matter. But if I look through the annals, where do we find Mulligans in the annals? We do find them here, and we actually find them here. So what little evidence there are in the annals does seem to correspond with what the DNA is telling me. So I have my Mulligan genealogy done to 1790. Big gap, but somewhere around 1000, 1100, I know the Mulligans were here. And the 1100 is an interesting one, because around the year 1000, give or take, that's when Irish men and women started adopting surnames. So we actually, have the situation where the DNA is actually taking us beyond surnames, beyond what any record could really show us. Just out of curiosity, my closest Mulligan cousins that I found in this branch are actually Mulligans out in Scotland. And when we did the maths, we actually connect back to a common ancestor around about 300 AD. So I actually have Mulligan cousins from all the way back to 300 AD in Scotland before ever there was a surname. So that's the why, and as you can see, that's the story of Irish men. We're missing 50% of the population. So we'll move on now to look at the whole picture. Here are the 23 pairs of chromosomes. We've spent the last few minutes talking about this little guy on the end, which, is fine, tells a good picture. Excuse me, but there's a lot more information. So to put it in perspective, I think the Y is somewhere around 50,000 letters long and the whole thing is 3 billion. So there's a lot more information there. The problem with looking at the big picture has always been, Y is simple. It goes from father to son, father to son. Not much is happening. The only thing you have to look for are the mutations. When you look at the whole picture, we all have a mom and a dad. And when they make us, we get 50% from mom, 50% from dad. Put in a blender and you are spit out somewhat unique set of DNA. So how do you make sense of something that's gone through the blender like that? And how that was unlocked, if we go to the next slide, was this. This is a landmark paper that came out in Nature in 2008, done by a guy by the name of Professor November in Chicago and a few others. And what he did is he took a couple of thousand men and women from all across countries in Europe. He also looked at their genealogies so that they weren't recent migrants to that country. So, for example, if the Irish people in the study were in Ireland for a long period of time, they weren't, young Polish people moving in. They were Irish people who had at least grandparents in that place. So without any historical or any geological or geographical input, he did what's called a principal components analysis on all of these couple of thousand samples, and he plotted them on a map. This is just a PC1, PC2 plot that you get with principal components analysis. And without any input, remarkably, it matched a map of Europe. So we can see down here, we see Spanish and Portuguese, and then we see a gap, and we can see that the Spanish and Portuguese are genetically slightly different from the French and the Swiss and the Belgians, and in real life, this border is actually the Pyrenees Mountains. We can also see that Ireland is slightly further away than Great Britain on this map, and here's Scottish, slightly out here. Here we see the leg of Italy comes down here. And this one's unusual here. This little bit of Italy out here is actually Sardinia. Sardinians are kind of an unusual lot, genetically speaking. They actually have the oldest genes in Europe, you could say. They link back to some of the earliest genes. So what we have here is a new way to look at the entire genome that allows us to look for differences in the genes of the whole autosomals, the 22 autosomal pairs. So there's the map of Europe with the same coloring, and there's the map. So anybody working in genomics and in genetic genealogy, this is kind of our Mona Lisa. This is the key to unlocking all sorts of different analysis. So with this type of analysis, different groups of people have been analyzing all sorts of different reference populations to see where the differences are. And this is the picture that's starting to emerge. If we go ahead. The next slide shows us. The first thing it tells us is that the picture is quite consistent with what we've seen in the Y. We started out in Africa, and after about 100,000 years ago, we ventured out. But because we're looking at the whole genome, not just the Y, we can get a lot more information. What we know from the archaeology before we had DNA is we weren't the first to leave. There were other homogeneous, other members of the human family already out there in the world making their way for hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens got out there. There were the ones we all grew up with, the Neanderthals, who have this kind of image of the guy with the club, the caveman. And they got their name because they were first found in the Neander Valley in Germany. And a couple of years ago, we had a new human family to talk about, the Denisovans, who were found in the Denisova cave in Russia. And they've got the name Denisovans. So we have at least Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, Denisovans, and these people then here, who were found in Flores Island in Indonesia, a third species of human, who, because of their unusually short stature, have the unfortunate nickname of being the hobbits, because they were about yay big. And what we know is, and this is where DNA comes to the fore telling us about history, one of the big questions of prehistory is, what happened to Neanderthals? Where did they all go? The general consensus was, we killed them all. We came out, saw these guys with clubs, and we just, bashed them because we were smart. What we've seen when we look at the DNA evidence is that's not really true. Firstly, the archaeology tells us that the Neanderthals were actually bigger than us, and actually had slightly bigger brains, and if anything, they were a more developed species. So what happened when we met? Well, instead of making war, we actually made love. So what we had when we met Neanderthals, we did what humans do whenever they meet. They mated. Neanderthal men with Homo sapien women, Neanderthal women, Homo sapien men. And that shows up in our DNA. On average, every European has about 2% Neanderthal DNA inside of them. I have slightly more, make of that what you will. I have it somewhere around 3.1. So once we got out of Africa, we started meeting other types of human species. We interbred with them. One of the hypotheses at the moment is the reason the Neanderthals became extinct is, well, one, they're not really extinct because we're all part Neanderthal, but two, we kind of overwhelmed them with our DNA. As we were kind of mating with them, more of our DNA kind of took over, and some of their DNA actually didn't survive when they met us because we had certain things they did. So if we get out of Africa, how do we get to Ireland? That's the next part of this story. From what we can see, there have been 3 big migrations into Europe, and that's what shows up in the DNA record. So as we can see, from the dawn of time, there have been migrations from the southeast into Europe. It's not a new phenomenon by any means. The first one that we know about that shows up in our genetics is around 45,000 years ago, there was an ice age that started to recede, and Europe became a little bit more hospitable. And the first group of migrants came up. They were the hunter-gatherers. They were following their prey, chasing it around. And we see sort of artifacts of that still in caves where we've seen cave paintings, but also in the DNA of some of the ancient DNA samples that we've obtained. The next group of people was driven by technology. At some point, some man or woman got fed up of chasing their food and decided to put down some roots and grow a seed. There is a lot of debate about how somebody suddenly thought, if I stay here for 6 months watching a plant, that'll become more effective than chasing a deer. But somewhere in the Fertile Crescent over here, somebody discovered farming. And that was huge. That made a huge impact on the environment, but also made an impact on our DNA. So somewhere in the Neolithic period, around 8,000 years ago, farmers started entering Europe. And as they went, they were changing the landscape, cutting down forests, ploughing fields, changing the landscape, bringing with them animals and domesticating them. No longer chasing animals, but having sheep and cows and dogs. And in fact, there's a whole branch of DNA studies looking at animals, not the humans, and to do exactly the same genomics that we're doing with humans. But that change in the environment also had a change on us. One of the things that we do as Irish people that is actually very unnatural is drinking tea with milk, or having milk at all in adulthood. It's actually not something that most of the world does. But when farmers started appearing with cows with a ready-made supply of nutrient milk, the genes that allowed you to digest milk into adulthood, they started having a reason to exist. And natural selection took its place. Some people often ask, can we see evolution happening in real time? And you can't because of the way, it takes a bit longer. But in this period of time, you can actually see how we actually have a slightly different breed of human evolving with the ability to digest milk. Those people who are lactose intolerant will tell you it's not lethal, but it's definitely not fun. The last group of migrants came through fairly recently, 4,000, and again, technology was the driver. What was the difference between the farmers in this group? It was metals. Bronze Age, Iron Age. And this group of people, they had metals to make tools, better weapons, very important, and things like chariots for mobility. And this group cut a big swathe across the Pontic steppe, rushing all the way across. Now when it comes to Ireland, again back to Dan Bradley and his lab in Trinity, who've been blazing a trail for Irish genetics. There was a study released last year by Laura Cassidy from Dan Bradley's lab, which looked at a few Irish ancient DNA specimens. The first one was Balnahattie woman, which was Neolithic farmer era person. And the other three were Rathlin Island men, who were around Bronze Age, about 4,000 years ago. And what they found from the DNA of these ancient samples is there was a very big difference within 1,000 years in Ireland. So if we look at Balnahattie woman, her DNA most closely resembles modern day southern Mediterranean people around Italy, Spain. But if we look at Rathlin men, their DNA more closely resembled modern day Irish. In fact, if we look at the Y, because of men we looked at the Y, we actually find they have the same M343 or 1B signatures that most of us in this room have. So the orange line, the Bronze Age, shows you that there was a genomic event in Ireland around 4,000 years ago. And this is actually, Dan Bradley himself says, this is not the consensus view amongst archaeologists, because a question was asked, how did, things like the Irish language, how did relatively modern things come into Ireland? Was it an exchange of ideas, or was it a displacement of people? The genetic evidence is suggesting that there was a displacement of people somewhere around the start of the Bronze Age, because before the Bronze Age, you had one genomic profile. After the Bronze Age, you have a different genetic profile. And that tells us that something happened when these guys came rearing over the Pontic Steppe and into here. And Dan, when he gives a talk, he references the movie Highlander, movie which is great for so many reasons. But there's a guy in there called the Kurgan, and these guys pretty much were that model of the Kurgan, that they just blaze a trail through there, destroying everything in their wake. This is still in early stages. There's a lot of people who don't accept it, but it matches the genetic evidence. And what this is telling us is that Irish people today are pretty much like Rathlin men. So these are people from 4,000 years ago were found on Rathlin Island. Well, they were found recently, but they've been on Rathlin Island for 4,000 years. And they are remarkably similar to most Irish people today. So even if you take into account subsequent invasions, the Vikings, the Normans, the British, we're still predominantly this group of Irish people. And that leads us to the next level of analysis we can do. This is where we get really current, and this is the type of analysis that we do in Ancestry all the time. This is, so when I submit my sample to Ancestry, it finds a whole lot of people I match as cousins, but it also makes an estimate of what it thinks are the principal components of my DNA at a level. And the way it does this is we have 26 reference panels around the world, and these reference regions are composed of people who lived in those regions for a long time. So our Irish reference panel, they all have grandparents who were in Ireland, in most cases great-grandparents or great-grandparents who are all Irish. And we compare, in this case, my DNA to theirs. And what it sees when it looks at my DNA is, I'm 93% Irish, so I am Irish. It's sort of useful to know. And there are echoes, and no more than faint echoes. We call them trace regions because we have lower confidence. But the regions that show up are the regions we associate with the Normans, the Vikings, and the British. And what this is telling me here is that Irish people are pretty much unique in that we're very, if I can use a double negative, on-admixed. Admixture is what geneticists refer to, population geneticists, as this mixing of DNA of different groups. Irish people are quite uniform with respect. Like if you get somebody from France or Germany, they're going to have a whole load of regions, about 20-30%. Most Irish people are going to be like 80-90%. So we're a fairly homogenous group of people with only distant echoes in our population of the genes that have come in from the other invasions. My dad, for example, he has Scandinavian somewhere around 6 or 7%, but that's because his roots are more Dublin than mine, and he's picking up some of that. In fact, the only place where we see things that go beyond trace tend to be people who live near the cities. People in Dublin tend to pick up some British DNA. People in the south east pick up some Scandinavian DNA. But by and large, we're all pretty Irish. And this, at the end of 2016, is kind of state of the art, where for your 60 euros, and you can spit in the test tube, you send it off to Ancestry or one of the other companies that analyze your DNA, it'll come back and it'll tell you, roughly speaking, what your DNA is composed of, looking back over a period of 1,500 years. What I'm about to show you now is something we've been thinking of, how we go beyond that. This is something that we are still trialing and we still have in the lab. We'll be hoping to release next year. when our databases have got to the size they have, 2.5 million people in Ancestry, 5 million global, we can start to do a different type of DNA analysis. So far, everything I've talked about has been looking at my DNA and how my DNA differs from other people. But when you have a large database of people, you actually have a genetic network. And genetic networks are never uniform. Like, you don't have a whole group of people and they're all equally related to each other. The genetic network around me, for example, consists of my parents, who are genetically really close to me, 50% each, my sisters, who are a little bit further, and my cousins, and outwards in kind of ripples on a pond. And when you look at the database as a whole, you'll see that there are clusters, little communities all over the network. And then you can start to interrogate that network and say, why does this cluster form? Generally speaking, when you look at a cluster, it's not just a family group, it's bigger. It's usually a couple of hundred or 1,000 people. And what forms a cluster? Well, certain obvious things form a cluster. For example, in Donegal, where I grew up, there's a big mountain range behind it. Somebody who came over from Tyrone, over the mountains, it's a journey of about maybe 10 miles, was considered a blow-in. It rarely happened. So mountains are a natural barrier that means people usually marry people in the same village or the same town, because going over the mountain is just unheard of. Rivers are a natural barrier. We also have cultural and religious barriers. One of the curious games we used to play growing up in Donegal is, what's your surname and that's your religion? It was one of those things when you were out at a nightclub and you'd meet somebody, you'd find out, what's your surname? Oh, you're an O'Neill, okay, you're that one, or you're a Williamson. And instinctively growing up, you knew whether they were Protestant or Catholic. And what happens is, in very simplistic sense, as we see in Donegal, Protestants tend to marry with Protestants, Catholics tend to marry with Catholics. But that happens all over the world. People marry within their own religion. And not for necessarily any particularly strong prejudicial case, it's the people they know, it's the people they encounter. So we find these clusters can happen because of geography, because of culture, because of tradition. Now when we look at Ireland, we actually see at the moment somewhere around 15 different clusters across the country. And that's what we've seen in the science. There are approximately 6 clusters in Connacht, we've seen. There's a very strong cluster in Connemara. There's a cluster in Mayo, Sligo. And there's a cluster around Sligo into Roscommon. Now people local will tell you, oh yeah, that's obvious because those people all stick together. But the science is telling us this without any a priori knowledge. And I've asked the guys in the lab to kind of go through mine. And so if we go to the next slide, this is my DNA got put in, and this was the cluster that it suggested I belonged to, the Southwest Donegal cluster. So it's pretty accurate. I didn't tell them my family history. I just said, here's my raw DNA, go analyze and tell me where I'm from. And the answer came back, said, well, you're strongly connected to Southwest Donegal. And that's where the DNA is taking us next. What this is looking at is, so far I've talked about timeframes of 200,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago. This is all the way right up to the last 300 or 400 years. We can see that I belong to a cluster in Southwest Donegal. I was on Ray Darcy's show last month, and I did Blahan and Nicoffey's DNA, and we did the same analysis, and it put her in a Connemara cluster here. Ray himself actually ended up in a cluster over here, and his producer Will Hannafin was in a cluster around Cork. There's another 6 clusters we've identified in Cork. And next year we'll be in a position where we actually will have this kind of, bedded in and working just the way we want it and tweaked. And at that point, you'll be able to come and identify not just the country that you're most associated with, but potentially the area you're most closely associated with. But here's another thing that this clustering technology does. It's a global database at Ancestry. There's people who've taken the test from America, there's people taking the test from Australia, UK and so on. So you can actually see how that community branches out into the diaspora. If we look at the next slide, which is the next piece of analysis that guys did, here is this community, Southwest Donegal. Here you can just about make out the line, and this is how it is branched out. Now anecdotally I could tell, yes, I know I have cousins in Glasgow, I know I have cousins in Boston, but what this has done is, not assuming it knows anything about my family tree, it's just looked at my genetics and who I'm related to, and who they are related to, and what those people have in their family trees. So if we analyse all the trees from all the people in the community, we start to build up a picture of migration. As John Grenham has famously said several times, nobody ever emigrated to America. They all went over to Uncle Pat. And that's what happened. People went over to people they know. They married people they know. And the last piece of analysis, which I haven't included, is it analyzes these communities for other things that the communities share. And one of them is surnames. And the surnames for Southwest Donegal were things I recognised. There was Gallagher, there was Boyle, there was Harkin. These are names that I would know growing up. These names actually are in my family tree in a lot of cases. But then at the bottom of the list, it showed the top 10 names in this community. Bottom of the list was Lombardo. And that didn't seem right. Now, by coincidence, the guy who sits next to me in the office, he is Italian, and I was laughing at it. Hey, guess what? I have an Italian in Southwest Donegal. And he said, oh, that's funny, I have a Kelly in Northwest Italy. And then we looked into it and went back to the science and we said, we think we found a bug. We're getting Italians in the Irish cluster, and we're getting Irish in the Italian cluster. And the guys looked at the data and said, nope, what happened was the Irish and the Italians got to New York and they got together because they were good big Catholic families. What I was picking up was, here's where the Lombardos were coming into the Donegal Southwest cluster. So it's actually reaching out beyond the diaspora and finding things that even I didn't think were possible to be there, but it's showing us the connections. So all the previous analysis has been how my DNA got me to the northwest corner of Ireland. This analysis is kind of new for me because it shows me where all my ancestors' relatives went from northwest Ireland. And that is kind of a big stretch through time from Adam to Europe to the modern world. And that's what the DNA can tell us about our past. Thank you.